All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of the Compliance Guy Live. My name is Sean Weiss, and I am so excited to be here today. I think we have a great show for you. Two of really respected attorneys with central focus on health law are joining me for 2 different segments today. Really excited to be able to have these conversations about topics that are critical but seem to be flying under the radar of most people that are working in hospitals, health systems, physician practices, group practices, because they may not be sexy topics. They may not be things that are always at the top of your watch list or to-do list. And as a result, you wind up letting these things kind of fester before somebody actually points out to you that you got a problem. And usually when somebody points out to you that you have a problem, it can wind up being a little bit too late. So I think part of the theme for today's show is being proactive and not waiting for a problem to rear its ugly head. Recognition of what the statutes and what the laws are and what's going on with the 3-letter contractors to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So again, I think the theme of today's show is being proactive. And I don't know that I could have picked 2 better guests to join me on this broadcast today than Amanda Wesch and Jenna Godlewski of Godlewski. Yes, thank you, Scott. And I caught myself. Who will be joining us after Amanda's segment. So let me quickly begin by introducing Amanda Wesch. Amanda has been practicing health law now for probably right around 15 years. She looks like she just actually graduated high school. But I will tell you, I have the distinct honor and privilege of getting to work with Amanda on almost, it feels like a daily basis. We share some clients together. I have a lot of opportunities to bring her into discussions with clients who are finding their back up against the wall due to one or more issues that have arisen. And we can obviously talk about some of those. And I think actually one of those clients and one of those scenarios is actually applicable to the conversation that we're going to have today regarding Stark and the profit sharing aspect of that. But Amanda is a vice president with Brenna, Manna, and Diamond. They are based out of Ohio, but Amanda's practice is nationwide. For those of you that don't know Amanda, I think this is a wonderful opportunity for you to have a first introduction to her. You'll get to see what I, along with our clients, get to experience each and every single day when we work with her. Amanda gives a lot of lectures for different societies around the country. She does work with the National Alliance of Medical Auditing Specialists, NAMUS. I know she's going to be presenting in December this year. So again, I don't want to take much time away from the show. I hope my introduction, Amanda, did you justice. If there's anything that I left out, please take a couple of moments and let our folks know who are listening a little bit more about you and your practice.
Oh, Sean, thank you for having me. The introduction was very humbling. So I enjoy working with you. We've worked together for years. Your team is amazing. And so glad that I could be here today and that we can have this conversation, because this is something that we've been talking about a lot and helping our mutual clients out on. And so we definitely want to get the word out to as many providers as possible, because you're right. The theme is about being proactive. I feel in 2020, we did a lot of reacting, and that's nobody's fault. It just happens. But in healthcare, it is really important to be proactive on the compliance side. I know you're going to talk about on the revenue cycle side with Jenna and her component of the presentation. But it is important to be proactive and not to be that low hanging fruit.
Absolutely. And I think that's really, a valid point is, the government tends to go after, as do the commercial payers. And I think that's something that I've tried to convey over the first, couple of episodes of this show, with former and current prosecutors, Michael Cook and Robert Lyles. And then, on episode 2, really, breaking it down with a former special agent from the Office of the Inspector General, Eric Rubenstein, and Jordan Johnson from OncoSpark, where, because he's really into statistics and data analytics. And I think to your point, and I know Jenna and I are definitely going to have this conversation, data is king, and data drives these conversations. And I think it's the data that, if practices aren't proactive with understanding what's in their practice management system, what their, billing patterns are, what their coding patterns are, those things that are detectable, those things that are low-hanging fruit. Without that information, you're a wide open target. And, and that's when people like yourself and Jenna, wind up getting phone calls from individuals going, oh my God, I just got a letter that they want me to pay $1 million back. And, if people, if healthcare leaders, and that's really who we're talking to today, right? We're talking to healthcare leaders, and we're trying to help them to understand that the priority and the emphasis that you put into picking a cake for somebody's birthday that you're going to celebrate at the office, if you would put just 1/10 of that energy into your compliance aspects, and you would pay attention to that stuff, most of your problems could be eliminated, right? I mean, obviously, if your name gets thrown into a hat and you're the lucky dog that day, there's nothing you can do about it, right? You're going to get audited, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles. But to your point, Stark's been around forever, right? And it was really interesting. I saw an interview a while back with Peter Stark out of California, who Stark Law is obviously named after. And, he was talking about the fact that had he known what Stark Law was going to morph into, he's not sure that he actually would have put it forward in the manner that he did. And that's why we had Stark 1, Stark 2, Stark 3, and there's so many ideations of it. But
that's when he asks for it to be named after somebody else.
Yeah, you're not kidding. You're not kidding. So I think, that's why it leads us to the conversation that we're about to embark on, in the next 20, 25 minutes or so, which is the issuance of the final rule in November of 2020 regarding Stark Law. And I think, you and I were talking pre-show just for a little bit about what some of the more pronounced aspects of Stark are that people are sort of familiar with. But then there's this whole segment, this whole section of Stark that's just completely flying under the radar that people are actually missing. So, Amanda, let me turn this over to you, and I want you to kind of navigate us through this conversation of what is it that the final rule really talks about and puts out for people to be aware of.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the Stark Law. The Stark Law, so named after Pete Stark, it has gone through various changes, phases 1, 2, 3, obviously a lot of other regulatory updates along the way. And these new regulations that came out at the end of 2020 were long awaited regulations. We've been craving them as healthcare attorneys, as legal geeks, we have been craving for these regulatory updates to come out. It has taken the government many, many years. And interestingly, they called it a sprint. So I guess, I made the joke. I was giving a presentation a couple months ago, and I made the joke, even though the government called it a sprint, I guess if you're talking government years, like dog years, it was a sprint, but for us, it felt like a marathon that, was paused in between. So we have anxiously been awaiting these regulations to come out. They went into effect in January of 2021. But as Sean, as you stated, there are some pieces of the regulations that have kind of flown under the radar. So I want to break down the regulations into two parts. So the Stark Law is interesting because it's a strict liability statute. So that's why everyone says Stark Law first, because it's the one that you definitely need to comply with. Because if you do not meet an exception, if Stark Law applies to your arrangement and you do not meet an exception, then you're going to have strict liability. So it doesn't matter if you, lacked intent or didn't know any better or wasn't aware that it applied to you. It doesn't matter. If it applies to you and you don't meet an exception, then you're out of compliance. And, common examples that we used to have were if, a common example would be if a contract has expired and the parties didn't realize it, it was missing a signature, or if there was one term that was just, or one element of the exception that wasn't met, you were automatically out of compliance. And so as we've started to look at the business of healthcare and how parties really interact with each other, the laws and the regulations are slowly starting to evolve and address some of those business practices and those business needs, frankly. And so when I say that these regulations are long awaited, we have been engaging in value-based arrangements because there's been a shift, especially under the Obama administration. It was not pay for, not fee for service, but pay for performance, more value-based versus volume-based payments. But the problem is that there was uncertainty. Does the Stark Law let us do that? And so these regulations that were passed and implemented in January of 2021 now allow us to do that.
Right. And let me go back for just a moment, because I know that we have a variety of different type of viewers and folks who are going to be listening to us, once the show is archived. So we have attorneys who listen. We have compliance professionals, administrators, different healthcare professionals. You talked about this being a strict liability law, right? Can you expound on that a little bit? Because a lot of people talk in the same sentences sometimes with Stark and anti-kickback, right? It almost feels like when you're saying Stark, for whatever reason, you feel compelled to say anti-kickback in the same sentence, or vice versa.
Absolutely.
And
like Tony Orlando and Dawn.
That's
They
right.
always go together.
And so, for me, when you talk about Stark being a strict liability law versus the anti-kickback statute, which is what? It's a criminal law.
Intent-based.
It's intent-based.
Right?
Okay, so let me pause, because you're the attorney. I want you to kind of take that floor and explain that.
Sure. So that's a great question. So we often say Stark and anti-kickback together in the same sentence, and rightfully so. So we should analyze any arrangement under both the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute. So the Stark Law applies to arrangements between physicians and entities to which physicians refer. So that would be a hospital, an ambulatory surgery center, laboratory, pharmacy, home health agency, just to name a few. If the physician has a financial arrangement, which could be either a contractual arrangement or an ownership arrangement, we're going to need to look at that relationship under the Stark rule and see if an exception applies. If an exception applies and you have to hit every single element of the exception, then we're going to be compliant with the Stark law. If an exception does not apply, and we're not able to find an exception, then it's going to be in violation of the Stark law. And again, you have to meet each and every element of the exception for the arrangement to be permissible under the Stark law. Now, let's talk about anti-kickback. The anti-kickback statute was passed long before Stark and is actually a little bit broader in scope. So instead of applying to just physician arrangements with an entity to which the physicians refer, the anti-kickback statute is going to apply to healthcare providers and non-healthcare providers that are in a place or have a relationship where they can refer patients and they can refer items and services to one another. So it can apply to an administrator that's in a position to arrange referrals to a certain provider. So it can apply to healthcare providers and non-healthcare providers. So it's a little bit broader. However, it is an intent-based statute. And so there has to be a level of knowledge that you are violating the anti-kickback statute. An anti-kickback statute prohibits giving value for referrals or receiving value for referrals. And we call that remuneration. So you may hear that funny word, remuneration. You can't give remuneration, you can't receive remuneration in exchange for referrals. And so the anti-kickback statute prohibits that. And as I said, it was an intent-based statute. There has to be some level of knowledge. Now, knowledge is interpreted as you either know or you should have known. So I call that, you can't be an ostrich in the sand, right? You can't have your head down and say, well, I didn't know. Healthcare providers, they are under an obligation to know the healthcare laws and that the anti-kickback statute could apply to their arrangement. And so the level of knowledge and intent is knew or should have known.
Got it.
Now, under the anti-kickback statute, as I said, it is an intent-based statute, but we have what we call safe harbors. Safe harbors are analogous to the Stark exceptions, but you don't necessarily have to meet a safe harbor in order to be completely devoid of any liability under the anti-kickback statute. So you want to, if you meet all of the elements of a safe harbor, then you're going to be found fully compliant with the anti-kickback safe harbor or the anti-kickback statute. If you do not meet all of the elements of a safe harbor, we still look at the arrangement to see, is there intent to provide remuneration in exchange for referrals? And we need to do an analysis as to whether that intent exists. So two statutes that are very similar, but yet very different. And so we definitely want to, when we look at an arrangement, we want to do an analysis under both laws.
Okay. And when you talk about knowledge base, obviously most people are familiar with the term when they say knowingly, right? But
knowingly.
But there's also willful neglect, right? And there's also deliberate ignorance. How do those play into it?
So that's that either actual knowledge or should have known. So should have known is that willful neglect. I kind of know that law is out there, but I'm not going to read it. I don't think it applies to me. I'm not even going to look and see if it applies to me because then I won't know, and that's when I refer to the ostrich in the sand type thing. I don't know and I don't want to know because then I can't be charged with actually knowing. That's not the standard. So that would be a willful neglect or a deliberate ignorance. I'm deliberately not knowing or not analyzing so that I can't be found with actual knowledge.
Got it. Okay. So I think that does a great job of clarifying the difference between a strict liability versus the intent. So with that said, let's talk now more about, the aspects of Stark that people need to really be aware of and understand.
Sure, absolutely. So we talk about the regulations that were just passed in December of 2020, implemented in early 2021. We're looking at Stark law exceptions and anti-kickback safe harbors that apply to value-based arrangements. And so, this was, again, like as I said, these are regulations that we have been craving as healthcare attorneys because we've been doing value-based arrangements for some time. And there's always been a question of compliance. Is this permissible under the Stark Law? Is this permissible under the anti-kickback statute? Because this is very different than our fee-for-service world, where we perform a service, we get paid.
Right.
Now we're looking at value. So was there cost savings? Are we able to split the cost savings? So that would, can we engage in gain sharing arrangements? Can we pay providers for following certain clinical protocols that result in maybe additional services or additional items being charged to the Medicare program? But yet, when we look at the impact to care, there's definitely, an impact to outcomes and to the value of care provided. And so we've been struggling over the past couple of years with implementing these arrangements, but wondering, are they compliant under these laws? And so with these new exceptions under Stark and the new safe harbors under the anti-kickback statute, we're able to better analyze these arrangements and implement these arrangements. So there are basically 3 new exceptions, 3 new safe harbors that allow for value-based arrangements. And the 3 categories that you fall into are going to be based on the amount of risk that the parties have. So parties can have minimal risk and just be paid on, paid on for performance or for following certain protocols. There can be minimal risk where there's some fee for service, and then there's some upside, and then there could be full risk.
Right.
And it's analogous to entering into those third-party payment arrangements where you've got some fee for service or may have full capitation.
And that's interesting, that you bring up capitation, because this was sort of a conversation I had earlier in the day with some folks that I was talking about. And, and this leads into, and we can or cannot talk about it, whatever you want to do, I'm fine with. This leads into the conversation about value-based care, right? Value-based care versus volume-based care. And, obviously there's 3 sides to every story, right? There's yours, there's mine, and somewhere in the middle exists the truth, right? But I think this is one of the things that, a lot of people are struggling with, is how is the value-based care really going to work unless you move completely away from fee-for-service back into a capitation. And if you're an old guy like me who's been around, for 26, plus years in this industry, I remember capitation when it first came about, and it was a complete nightmare. Now, I think a lot of people may have learned some lessons from that, and hopefully, the lessons learned prevent us from repeating those same mistakes. I don't think it will prevent the payers from trying to structure contracts in the manners that they did in the past, because they were financially beneficial to them. But I think, people who have been around for a long time can give better guidance and better advice to those who are considering entering into a capitated agreement, including, carve-outs and things of that nature. But you talked about gain sharing, and I know you started to go into it. I think gain sharing is a big potential pitfall, right, for organizations, right? Because the gain sharing also ties into profit sharing, if I'm not mistaken, or am I crossing swords?
That's a great analogy. So I think it depends, going back to your first question, what is better, value-based or volume-based? I think it depends on, what's the goal that you're trying to achieve, right? So are we trying to be efficient and reduce costs and streamline, have some economies of scale and streamline the process? Well, then maybe we're going to be looking at gain sharing, right? So we're going to all be on the same plan. We're going to be following the same policies. We're going to be ordering from the same suppliers and manufacturers. We're going to show up on time. Right. We're going to, right? So we're going to be more efficient with our resources, which will result in lower costs. And when we lower costs for healthcare, it's better for everyone. And then we're able to share in the cost savings.
Got it.
So if that's what you're looking to do, gain sharing is a great option. But if you're looking to improve outcomes,
Right.
well, that may increase volume and that may increase costs because we're going to put a bigger emphasis on preventative services. So a bigger emphasis on screening and wellness. And, so we're front loading the costs. So that's going to increase costs,
Right.
but it's going to improve outcomes. So I think it really depends on what is the goal of the arrangement. And then you've got to structure it appropriately.
I think that's a brilliant analysis. And I think that's really such a great broken down way to explain it for a lot of folks. And I like to use the term uninitiated because, I think the more that we're able to get this kind of information out there to people, as boring as it may be, they start to recognize the pattern of criticality and how important this stuff is. And I think the other part to that, right, because we were talking about gain sharing, I think the other side to that, right, is the profit sharing that we were talking about. And we have a mutual client. And I think in the last, bit of time that we have together, because I think this is one of the aspects, if I'm not mistaken, right, that kind of flew under the radar is the profit sharing, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
If you could, please share with, our audience the way you would with myself, with any client that you were talking to, why they need to structure their profit sharing agreements in a certain manner and how should they look. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
All right.
Sean. So again, the word of the day is proactive. So we want practices to be proactive. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the new regulations that went into effect actually had two components. So the first component we've already went over, the new exceptions under Stark, the new safe harbors under the anti-kickback statute, some changes to some defined terms. But now I want to flip to the second component, and that's the one component that people are not really talking about. It's kind of flown under the radar. That component does not go into effect until January of 2022. So providers have a whole year, and now we're almost halfway through 2021, but providers have a whole year to get ready and make sure that they're in compliance. And so again, the word of the day is proactive. So let's talk about that second component that I mentioned earlier. So in the final rules, there were some changes to the Stark law and how group practices can structure their profit sharing arrangements. So we know under the Stark law that physicians can own group practices, they can be employed by group practices, and they can receive payment for services that they personally perform or services that are performed incident to the physician. So physicians can get reimbursed for office visits that they perform. They can receive compensation for surgeries and procedures that they personally perform. So there's never been an issue with paying physicians productivity on services that they personally perform. But when it comes to ancillary services and revenue from those ancillary services, that has to fall into the profit sharing bucket. So some common examples would be if you've got imaging in your office, lab, DME. Those are all good examples of common ancillaries. And if group practices receive revenue from those ancillaries, you're not able to bonus the physician that referred that service. It has to go into a profit sharing bucket. So that has not changed. That concept is still the same. However, the way that we structure our profit sharing plan has changed. So in the past, the group has a lot of flexibility in how to structure that profit sharing plan. They can distribute the ancillary service revenue or the DHS revenue. They can distribute it per capita. They can distribute it by seniority. They can distribute it by ownership. They can also distribute it based on profits from personal productivity. So there's lots of different ways that you can structure it. You can be creative. And in the past, some groups have separated it out by ancillary services. So maybe only the orthos in the group get, they share in the imaging revenue. maybe only the primary cares share in the lab revenue. That is not permissible. You cannot have these split pools anymore.
Got it.
So when you group together the ancillary revenue, you have to distribute it to all physicians based on the same methodology. Now, one thing that you can do, and this has been true before, and it stays true, you can set pods of 5 up within the group. It has to be at least 5 physicians. Mid-level providers will not count, but you can have groups of 5. It can be based on specialty. It can be based on where they're located. And you can distribute ancillary revenue within that pot of 5, but it has to be via the same methodology.
Got it.
In that pot of 5 or in the group. So you want to take a look at your profit sharing arrangement and make sure that you don't have the split profit sharing. You want to make sure that your methodology is compliant with Stark and the new regulations. And again, that goes into effect January 1 of 2022.
Good. So basically, to reiterate in closing, is that providers have about 5 months, really, to be proactive, to have somebody like yourself, who's an expert in Stark, take a look at what their current structure is as an organization, to take a look at what their profitability is into areas where they're actually sharing into profits within the organization for the different departments, if you will, and then structure or have restructured their current agreements if they don't fit into the requirements that Stark has put forth as part of the final rule, which take full effect in January of 2022. Is that a fair summation?
That's a fair way to put it. And I will just close because I know that
Please.
All of you that are listening, you work for physicians, with physicians. We want to make them happy. Physicians don't like it when they're surprised or when their cheese is moved.
That's right.
Who moved my cheese? And if you take a step back, none of us like that, right? So you want to make sure that you're reminding your physicians, hey, there's been some changes. We need to look at it. We need to look at the structure and make sure we're in compliance. And then you're going to have plenty of time to look at, coming into compliance. If you need to make any changes, you're going to give yourself plenty of time to look at the financial ramifications and make sure that you tell your physicians how this impacts them going into 2022. You don't want to wait until December to drop this on them if any changes need to be made.
Awesome. Amanda, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of what I know is a hectic, crazy, busy schedule. And I think you did a heck of a job. You knocked it out of the park for our folks. Thank you for being part of this show. As always, it's such a privilege to be able to spend time with you. And every time I get to do that, I get to learn so much. So thank you again for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sean. I just really enjoyed my time and always a pleasure with you.
All right.
Love working with you. I'll see you in person soon.
You definitely will. So, all right. Everybody, we're going to go ahead and pause for just a moment, and we'll be right back with you.